I'd love to also just kind of rewind and understand, what did your parents do for a living? And I'm wondering, how did that impact some of the choices you made in your life?
Uh, both my parents were immigrants. My dad was born in Italy. He came here when he was 11. He sold bananas and apples in the Bronx and the inward section of Manhattan his entire life. He actually retired when he was 80, and he ultimately passed from Alzheimer's a few years later. But from the time he was 11 years old to the time he was 80, other than when he served our country in World War II, he was selling bananas and apples. And I worked for him from the time I was 10 till about 22 when I left to begin my coaching career. My mom was born in Ireland. She met my dad after the war and ultimately came to this country to marry him. And mom never finished 10th grade. She had 5 kids, and dad wasn't always the easiest guy to live with. He worked very, very hard, 13, 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. Maybe it took 4 or 5 days of vacation a year. And mom's life really was taking care of us. She ultimately, as we got older, she ultimately learned how to drive when she was in her 40s. As she went to cosmetology school, she got her cosmetology license, and she opened up a beauty parlor when she was about 50. So that's my mom and dad. I never worked for my mom in the beauty parlor, though.
But it would have paid off in a pandemic. You would have been the in-house barber or stylist.
That's right. Good point. Good point. Of course, that means I'm still living at home.
Yeah, right. It's funny. My wife got her cosmetology license, and she's with the kids now. But she became, pretty much the in-house stylist. So I'm wondering, how did that upbringing maybe impact some of the choices that you made in your life or your career?
Well, I think in terms of, you got to think about my dad's personality versus my mom. My dad was always a glass half full guy. And if there was a problem, frankly, it was usually somebody else's fault. But he was an incredibly hard worker. He did a good job in the food store, and he was committed to taking care of his family. He was also a pretty devout guy. My mom, on the other hand, the glass was always half full. She kind of unconditionally loved you. She was always supporting you. She was always had a smile on her face. She was always fun to be around. And that's the image I have of each. So in terms of the impact that it had on me, when I was 22 and I got my first head coaching job, I thought there had to be a bigger reason for why I'm coaching other than the game of football. And it was the impact I knew I could have on the players. And so the very first time I met my team, I told them about this philosophy, and it was stand on your own 2 feet, take responsibility for yourself, treat others with dignity and respect, live with the consequences of your actions. Now, I wrote that when I was 22. That is the single philosophy standard that I've had in my life that I have built my football programs on, and the same thing in the business world, whether it's regardless of what level I might have been at. So part of that philosophy is, you're taking responsibility for yourself. You don't make a lot of excuses. So much what I learned about my dad in terms of leadership and this philosophy, this principle, was what not to do. It was the opposite of what my dad was doing. So I had his work ethic. I always had a desire to be the best I could be, but I always took responsibility for myself. And I treated people differently than what my dad did. On my mom's side, I think that had a lot to do with my personality, my sense of humor, and again, my positive attitude. So that's what that is.
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I appreciate you sharing that. So how old is Kevin, your son? I know you have like 6 kids total.
Just 44, 45, just turned 45.
Okay. If I ask Kevin, what kind of dad was Joe growing up? What do you think he would say?
I think he would say he was a tough love guy. I think he would say that, you always knew that dad was there for me if I needed him. But if dad said something, he really did mean it. He wasn't fooling around with that. If that meant he'd be there to support you, he was there to support you. But if he meant you were supposed to do something a certain way, that meant you were supposed to wind up doing something a certain way. My family was raised on the same principle that I'm talking about. Stand on your own 2 feet, take responsibility for yourself, always treat others with dignity and respect, live with the consequences of your actions. That's what I think Kevin would say. He'd probably even repeat that. He'd repeat that philosophy.
Oh, that's awesome. That's why I've heard you talk about your kids kind of just through some of your talks. And I know you've made, it's really fascinating to me also having young kids, because I've heard you make, and I'd love to dig into this a bit, but at some point, you've made, call it sacrifices, or had to make tough decisions, keeping family in mind. And so, yeah, it's just really fascinating to me, like how you operate as a dad, how you try to instill those things in your kids, how that affects some of the life and career decisions you made in the past. So those things I think people can learn a lot from.
I couldn't agree more. Omid, to help with this a little bit, I mentioned that philosophy, that standard. It's really a leadership standard. But when I left Nebraska and I took the head football job in the Omaha Nighthawks in the UFL, and then from there I went to Coastal Carolina, that same philosophy became part of our playbook. But again, I've got 120 players. They're all guys. I've got another 25, 30 coaches, analysts, interns. They're all guys. So with all the males, we call that be a man. BAM. So BAM became the acronym. BAM became the standard. But that's the same philosophy that I raised my daughters on. It's the same philosophy that I held any female executive that I worked with, whether on Wall Street or in football or academia, the same standard. So BAM has become synonymous with that entire leadership philosophy. So my children, I believe, are raising their children on that BAM principle. And they'll remind them every now and again to BAM up, because they're not taking responsibility for themselves.
I love that. And I was like looking at your record at Coastal Carolina, like I was just curious myself, like when you got there, because you had success pretty quickly and then you consistently had success for the most part. Is that something you implemented even there, like quickly, or did you inherit, a fairly good team already?
I inherited 71 guys from the previous team. And of those 71 guys, 25 of them had been some sort of issue. And the previous year, they were ranked 89th in the country out of about 120. And our previous 5 years, we were 29 and 28, but we were 1-9 against the two best teams in our league. And half those games were really embarrassing. So I don't know if I inherited good kids, I think. I think the difference Omid was we did two things that nobody in college football did. And we made a big deal about this. Number one, we didn't have any rules. Literally, there were no rules. We had a standard. The standard was BAM. So if you came, and I was talking to the kids, the recruits or their parents, I made it very, very clear that if you come here and you don't play well, you can't play. Well, that's our fault because we didn't do a good job of evaluating you as an athlete. However, if you come here and you don't live up to BAM, if you're not taking responsibility for yourself, not just for football, but academically, everybody knows our football guys. So therefore your behavior on campus and off campus, and every one of our guys is always going to be somebody's son or somebody's brother. We expect to live up to that responsibility of family. So that was it. We had no rules. We had that standard. And that standard applies to everything. Now remember, I started that when I was 22. And that has stayed with me my entire career. The only difference later on, when I began at Coastal, we called it BAM. So that's the first thing we did that nobody else did. The second thing we did, nobody else did, we gave up 30 minutes of practice a week to talk about things that had nothing to do with football. It might have a lot to do with BAM, but it didn't have anything to do with football. And I thought that was critical in terms of laying a foundation upon which our guys were going to build their lives later on. So we call that LAF, life after football. So there are two things that nobody in college football gives up 30 minutes of practice a week. We did. We do. And nobody has no rules. That was us. So we began with that.
Why do you think creating that space for the life after football meetings were important?
Because I think it's more than just winning or losing. I think there is. I think at the high school, junior high school, college level, I think a big piece of our job is to help prepare for our guys for what life is going to be like when they're on their own. So they got to be able to lay a foundation. Now,
almost like a transitional sort of conversation.
Yeah, but it's so many things are going on in the world that too often they don't necessarily pay attention to. I mean, I give you a simple example. I think the biggest threat in the world today, well, right now is Russia and Ukraine, but previously I would say terrorism. And I wanted our guys to understand that that while we live in the greatest country in the world, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in the world that have unlimited funding that will not hesitate to give up their lives to take our lives away because they think we're the infidels, we're evil to them. And they have religious reasons for doing that. So I wanted my guys to really understand that. My guys knew what ISIS stands for. I bet you 95% of college students period, not student athletes, don't know what ISIS stands for. So then from there, well, how do we protect ourselves from this? Well, we got the military. So therefore, guys that are same age as my kids are putting their lives on the line. Why? So we can play college football, so we can live in freedom. So two things there. Number one, I want the kids to appreciate what's going on if somebody's laying their life on the line. And then secondly, recognize that with those freedoms that he's willing to give up his life for comes responsibility. We're right back to bad. So if the military is that important, we can only pray that our political and military leaders have the guts to do what they really believe is the right thing, regardless of whether or not to get reelected, regardless of whether or not to get promoted, for our national defense, national security over time. So what do we have to do with that? Well, we live in a democracy. We have the right to vote. In 2016, after 140 years of college football, the only football program whose entire team actually voted for the president of the United States was Coastal Carolina. It had never happened in 140 years. It happened in Coastal Carolina. So that's how all these things come together. So if we don't win, I want to get fired. And
there's a lot of winning going on, which is
but we are winning. We are winning, and I think we separate ourselves from others because of that philosophy. And then as the kids start to buy into it, that becomes more and more significant. That first team I told you I inherited, there were 25 guys that had issues. Those 25 guys had trouble living up to the standard. And within the next 9 months, I threw 14 of them off the team. 11 of them would have been starters. So that's how important I think that this philosophy is, of how you implement it.
When you think about like the dual careers that you had, right? Running companies, big companies, and then running big time programs. Like, do you feel like you were a better CEO because you had the coaching background, and you were a better coach because you had the CEO background? Like, how do you think of that?
Can I ask you a question? Can we stop and ask a question?
Totally.
Okay. So are my answers too long? You want me to shorten them? Just thought I'd ask you that now rather than I can.
No, it's perfect. No, I love it. I also love the fact that like you're a storyteller by nature. And I think that's the stuff that I love to hear, but also can weave into something that I write. Right. So someone's going to read it and think like, I'd love to listen to the whole thing. And boom, there's a link. Right. And so I think it's perfect. Sometimes people have one word answers, which is not bad, but like, it doesn't convey a lesson. Someone I heard said, how do you get people to change? You do it through inspired storytelling. And so I love the fact that, so it's not too long at all by any means.
Well, okay. So a lot of times too, though, when you say you get one word answers, most of the time you get one word answer because that's the type of question you ask. You ask your question. Like, do you understand that? Well, yes or no, as opposed, did you vote yesterday? It's yes or no. So I think, frankly, you do a great job of asking questions that really don't, it's almost inappropriate to be like, I wouldn't be listening to you if I gave you a yes or no answer.
No, I appreciate that. Yeah. And I try to think of like in advance of like, if I'm asking you a closed-ended question, to your point, I'm probably going to receive a yes or no response. And I think, just from hearing some of the things that you've talked about that in terms of what's online already, I think like a lot of value is from like unpacking some of this a bit further, but also, you met Ryan Hawk. He always says that he has a lot of respect for people that can have success in multiple life categories, and I think of like multiple careers. I also think of like coaching as a bit like an art and a science. Like that's I was thinking about this. I wasn't going to ask you this, but I was thinking, okay, if I rewind the clock to Miami, where you get this, coaching opportunity on the defense, they're going to pay you $1 million. Your, day job is going to offer you the same amount of money. Joe, which one do you take? I'm thinking you're absolutely going to take the Miami job. I don't know the answer specifically, but like that could be a closed-ended question, but I think like those are also just interesting things. I kind of wonder in hindsight, did you make the right move? Did you have any regrets? Like those are things that I love to learn about. And I think drive a lot of value for people.
Okay. So remember the question you asked me was as CEO, was I a better coach because CEO and that type of thing? Should I go back to that? Should I answer that one?
I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Yes.
In what way?
In terms of when I left coaching to go to Wall Street, I began in the institutional MBA training program at Merrill Lynch, and there were 26 of us, 25 MBAs from Harvard, Stanford, et cetera, one football coach. And everybody said this football guy wasn't going to make it here. But that's not the case. And a few years later, most of those MBAs were working for me. The typical MBA back then had to work on Wall Street for 2 years before they could even go to school. So they were about 27 years old. I was about 34, 35, but I had gone through an entire career. I coached for 16 years. I had 4 kids. I went through a divorce. I grew up in the streets. I worked in my father's fruit store. So the ability for me to be able to handle stress and think on my feet was a significant competitive advantage I had versus the others. I also listened better than I think what the others did. So that, a lot of that too came from coaching, the ability to be able to make decisions quickly, being really highly organized, the ability to have impact on others. So I was a much better beginning as a bond salesman, but then especially as I moved into executive management, I was much better in the business world because of my experience as a coach. Later on, when I decided to go back to football, which by the way, that was the toughest thing I probably ever had to do, was because nobody wanted me. Nobody was willing to kind of take the risk reward associated with me. I don't know if they really thought that through, but they weren't willing to take the risk in terms of hiring somebody like me because I was the first person like that. But when I went back to football, I was much better head coach, because of my experience as a leader in the business world. And there was no question about that. I have been asked, would I have preferred, do I prefer one versus the other? And the reality is, I was fortunate enough to do something in my life that I know I had the skill sets for and that I was really equally passionate about. So I wouldn't have given up either one of those careers for the other one. How many people get a chance to say they've had one career that they really, really love and had the skill sets for?
Why did you say it was one of the toughest situations? It was like you were sort of in the business world too long and it was hard to get like a head coaching job, or can you tell me a little bit more about that?
I think it was hard to get. I wanted to be a Division I head coach. Otherwise, I wasn't coming back because I knew that was my competitive advantage. I was going to hire coordinators. I was a very good coordinator when I was coaching, but I was away from the game for 24 years. And even though I had success in the business world, the typical athletic director, the typical college president, the few people that really, a handful of athletic directors did have interest in me, but got vetoed by the president. Then there may have been presidents that had interest, but they weren't going to do anything without support for people around them. And they weren't necessarily getting that. So I think the typical person in academia made a very, very big deal about they could not take the risk associated with me. Now, I had never done anything in my life that I wasn't successful at. And I was making a conscious decision at that point in my life to go back to football. And there was no way I was going back to football if I didn't really believe I could do that. But then those people had to believe in me. And that really, for the most part, the vast majority of people just didn't do that. The guy that did it was Dave DeCenzo, the president of Coastal Carolina.
Did you have to convince him, or how did that go?
He was following my career because when I was at Nebraska, there was some features in Sports Illustrated. There was some TV stuff on, I don't remember, ESPN or CBS or wherever it was at the time. But he started following my career, and he had a pretty good understanding of at least what that was. And he was concerned about the football program. He felt that the FCS level, the 1AA level, we should have been competitive nationally. And that certainly wasn't where we were. And I think he had made the decision when he reached out to me that if I were willing to take the job, as he got to know me better, then he was going to move ahead and make a coaching change. I think if I said no, I think they were going to wait and make the coaching change the year after, because they made the 2012 season as tough as they could, because they think it would have been difficult for the other guy to win doing that. And that would have made it easy to kind of make the transition. But the bottom line is he reached out to me. It was November 2011. And he said that, he introduced himself, and he said that, told me what he wanted to do with his football program. And he said he really believed I was the guy for that. He really wanted me to be the next coach and would love to get to know me, get to know each other, get a better feel for the school, et cetera. And that's when the Coastal Carolina became live to me. And I didn't know much about Coastal prior to that. And the first time we got together, I think may have been Thanksgiving weekend or something. And it was in South Carolina.
Did he also see the benefit of your leadership in the business world that could translate over fairly quickly?
without question. I think we also became very good friends, and he looked at me, I think, without a question, as an advisor to him. The new president we currently have, Michael Benson, like at his choice, he wanted me to stay, and my title is I'm executive advisor to the president for those reasons. And I think I can bring a lot to the table that many other coaches simply don't have, and I think that's a competitive advantage for me. When I was chairman of Ameritrade, TD Ameritrade, the whole while I coached, I was chairman of TD Ameritrade, and I remember thinking what a wonderful differentiation that was for me. There was no other coach in America could say anything like that. So when I talk about, I care about the future of your player, the future of your son, and who's going to be my player. I really, really mean that. And I've got a background to support that. So when I talk about different career plans, when I talk about what it's like away from college, away from sports, well, I've had a very, very real life experience with regard to that. And again, I think that gave me and us a competitive advantage.
I was thinking about the most important lesson before you came to Coastal, the most important lesson from the business world that you carried over. Is that BAM or is it something else?
Be BAM. I doubt, Omaid, that you could ask me a question that somehow doesn't go back to BAM, because it has an impact on all pieces of your life. And in the beginning, it's easy to say, oh yeah, that sounds cool. Be a man. That's really, really cool. And again, leadership acronym. But recognizing that's something you got to live up to. And all of a sudden you've been able, as a high school kid, maybe you were spoiled, a little bit entitled. And now all of a sudden you're really expected to take responsibility for yourself and everything that you do. There's a real standard there. There's a real standard for a little kid. There's a real standard for me today. It would be a real standard for you. So that would be within BAM. There were a couple of principles, but the BAM would have been, I think, my competitive advantage throughout my entire career in the business world.
Is there a conversation that you've had to have behind closed doors with one of the football players, kind of talking through sort of life? I'm just wondering if you could sort of like remember one of them and take me inside. Like, what did that sound like, thinking of that sort of leadership acronym and applying it to a student's real life and how that might have helped?
Well, no, I think there were plenty of examples where behind closed doors, I'd be talking to one of the players. Most of the time, the player would come to me proactively. And he would think in terms of even some of the guys that were good enough to go to the NFL or certainly be considered for the NFL, they were pretty serious about what the future was going to hold for them. And they sit down and say, Coach, I'm not sure which direction I'm supposed to go. So I don't know if I want to go in that, that career path or this career path. And I go back to BAM. So one of the principles of BAM is spiritual soundness. Omaid, in my opinion, most people do not know who they are. We are a composite of all the people around us. So we're a little different perception. We want people to like us. How do one of my players react to their girlfriend, a teammate, a classmate, one of their peers, their siblings, their parents, their coaches? And they're a composite of all that. And hey, you really got to get to know yourself. And there's a way to do that. We have exercises for the kids to go through with that. But once you really know who you are, you also know what your skill sets are. So we think about what career path you might want to do, not in terms of who you want to work for, but what's the functionality? What are you actually going to be doing? And then you got to do some homework. What are the skill sets required for that particular career path? Well, if you know yourself, you know what your skill sets are. If you don't have those skill sets, do not go down that path. If you do have those skill sets, you still got to ask yourself one other question. Is this something I'd be passionate about? If you can answer yes to both of those questions, that's the right career path for you. It probably is the right career path for you. And you probably have a competitive advantage over 85% of the people that are beginning of that career path because they've not gone through this process. So those would be the types of conversation we have. I wouldn't be directing somebody to a particular career path or a particular area or a particular field, but I would work hard at them trying to understand how to relate that spiritual soundness with your career path.
You have an example that comes to mind where you had to use that spiritual soundness exercise to make a decision?
I've got several of them. I think the first time, and I didn't think of it as spiritual soundness, but when I was getting married, and
I haven't heard this one, so I'm buckled in.
And when I was getting married, and then college sports were out for me. My hope was to play football and baseball in college, but I wasn't going to be able to do that now. And I remember talking to my father about going to college, and he said, "Well, remember, son, we don't have money for that." And I said, "I know, Dad. I figured that out." And he said, what you should do is you got to take care of your family now. You should work for me in the food store full time. And, you work hard, we'll do a good job. Maybe we'll get another food store, maybe another food store. And I'd worked for him already, but since the time I was 10. And I mentioned already that my dad didn't have much of a positive attitude. Most times he was in a bad mood. So maybe if I enjoyed working with him, I would have felt differently about that. But I said, okay. And I was respectful enough to go away and think about it. And I came back a couple of days later and said, Dad, I really think I got to go to college. And I really thought that through. And he said, son, I think you're making a big mistake. Okay. So I began college. So that's how I began college. So, but that gave me a lot to think about. And ultimately, because of that, so my freshman year, I'm paying every dime of my education. I'm supporting my family. I'm driving a cab in New York City, driving a truck for the post office in Old Chelsea Station, and I'm working for my father. And it was the first year I didn't have sports, and it wasn't the most fun a freshman ever had in the history of college freshmen. So Fordham Prep, where I went to high school, all boys Catholic high school in the Bronx on the same campus as Fordham University, I had a pretty good career there, and they offered me a coaching job. So my sophomore, junior, senior year, I coached high school ball during the season, worked for my father in the off season, majored in economics, wanted to go to Wall Street.
Kids yet or no? Not yet.
Sorry.
At this point, did you have kids yet or no?
I have kids.
At that point,
I became a father at the beginning of my sophomore year.
Okay.
But I really loved the coaching. I really did love it. And I decided that if I could get my own high school job, I'd want to pursue a career in coaching. If not, I'd try to go to Wall Street. It was that drive that made me really think of how hard I was working over the last few years. That decision I made to go to college, I paid every dime of my education myself. That decision was, and that's when I thought about you stand on your own 2 feet, the BAM principle, BAM philosophy. So I went through that spiritual soundness exercise when I decided I wanted to go to coaching versus Wall Street. And then every big decision I made career-wise, in some cases personally in my life, I really sat down and thought that through. And I went through that spiritual soundness exercise. I turned down some jobs, like very senior jobs, let's say at Merrill Lynch, because I recognized that that job really wasn't the right job for me. And I wouldn't perform as well or be as happy or as fulfilled in a particular assignment if I recognized that that wasn't the right thing for me.
What are a few of the questions that people can ask themselves if they just at least want to start doing the exercise or parts of it?
Well, there's two principles behind the exercise. The first is you write it down. You keep writing because you're going to keep a record of it. You write it down. The second thing is you can never, ever, ever tell anybody. And the reason why you can't ever tell anybody, this is you by yourself. This is you. Your religion is you and God. It's examination of conscience, but it's getting to know who you are. It's not worrying about anybody else. So the first time you go to your parent or your girlfriend or your brother or your buddy and say, what do you think of this? You're subconsciously looking for their approval. That's out. You can't do that. So the exercise is nobody ever finds out. Nobody ever becomes aware of what you're doing. And you're right. By the way, the first time you do this, and so what are some of the questions? Begin with, who am I really? What are my favorite colors? What's my favorite music? What do I like? What turns me on? What turns me off? What do I like to do in my spare time? What am I good at? What do I really don't like? What are my skill sets? What are the different things from different perspectives that I can actually do? What kind of athlete am I? What kind of a business person am I? What kind of father am I? What kind of brother am I? What kind of son am I? How am I doing in my own life physically? How am I doing in my own life from a financial perspective? You just keep talking about those things. You just keep writing. Then when you finish doing that, you go away from it. You come back 3 or 4 weeks later. Vast majority of the time, you're going to change 25 or 30% of those answers. And the reason for that is because you're going from a composite for everybody to really understanding who you are. And then you go back and say, you know what? I really don't like that type of music that much. I like that. My girlfriend likes it. Well, I wanted to go down that career path because that's what my dad does. Or somebody else influenced me along that. Oh, I like that particular coach or teacher. So then over time, you really hone it and you really get to know yourself. And that's why I call it spiritual sound. You're spiritually sound. You know who you are. You have peace of mind. We become happy, or the greatest chance or probability we have to be happy is whether or not we feel good about ourselves and we're fulfilled, period. And that happens by decisions you make under significant stress. So if you really know who you are and you have peace of mind, you increase the probability that you're going to make the right decision for yourself under serious stress. And by doing that, you're going to feel more fulfilled, and that's ultimately going to lead you to be happier as an individual, happier in your life, happier in your profession. That works, by the way. That really does. So the BAM principle, take responsibility for yourself, and really knowing who you are, they're the two competitive advantages I have in my lifetime.
I've heard you say also that, like, if you're hiring somebody or maybe bringing on a player, you like to see how they make decisions and perform under pressure, right? Like everyone's going to have similar resume, things like that. How can someone, I've heard like you test for it, you put people in uncomfortable situations, but how can someone improve at that? You know, maybe they didn't have your background and upbringing, but they say, hey, like, okay, if Joe says that's something they need to improve at, or people look for that, how do I perform under pressure? Well, is there a way I can simulate it to just improve that skill set?
Absolutely. The way you do that is to go through that spiritual soundness exercise. You begin by knowing who you are. Now, the key is, remember, BAM is, I will take responsibility for myself, period. Now, I will always treat others with dignity and respect. That's a given, and I'm going to live with the consequences of those actions. All right. So you begin with that. So you're taking responsibility for yourself. You better know who you are. That leads to the spiritual soundness piece. And then you go through the exercise, at least that I was talking about, the two other principles of BAM. Courage, and define that, the guts to do what you believe is right. So there's a lot of pressure to take a shortcut. There's a lot of there are a lot of things out there that you get rewarded significantly from a financial perspective. You're certainly seeing that in competitive sports. You're certainly seeing that in the NIL pieces going on now in college football. And you're going to cheat a little bit to be able to do that. You're going to cut corners. You know what your responsibility is as a father? Do you always live up to that? As a son, do you live up to that? As a student, do you live up to that? As a husband, do you live up to those things? So the guts to do what you believe is right. I pray that our military leaders have the guts to do what they believe is right when you have all these things going on in the world. And, we live on the precipice of something that could become World War III. The third piece then is love. Now, remember, this is a leadership. So you get to know who you are, and maybe you're not going to be one of those leaders, but you're going to be happy in terms of who you are. If you are a leader, concept of love is, to me, is the commitment to the well-being of others. It's the power of love. So it's others that you recognize that a leader is not about him or her. It's about the people that they represent and they're responsible for. You've got to get that. You've got to appreciate that. And you really see that with regard to your family. And you may have heard me tell stories about what happened on 9/11 and, with my son, Kevin, and my daughter, Kara. I'm happy to share that. So that's the way you do it.
Yeah, no, I would love to hear that.
So I had just taken the Ameritrade job, and I had just been out there a couple of months. Merrill Lynch headquarters, where I worked my entire 17 years with Merrill, downtown, about 100 yards from the World Trade Center. My apartment was about 200 yards from the World Trade Center. And three of my younger kids, Kim, Kara, and Kelly, had just moved. They were living in Brooklyn. And Kara and Kevin had begun at Merrill Lynch. Again, they're 100 yards from the World Trade Center. I live 200 yards from the World Trade Center, but now I'm living in Omaha. And I'm getting dressed in the morning. I'm seeing the planes go into the building. And I think, oof. Now, part of BAM, too, is you recognize what you can do and what you can't do. I got a lot of things going on in New York. And but there's nothing I can really do about those things now. I can't do anything to help my children right now. I can't do any of that. But right now, I have clients whose assets we got to protect. I've got employees who I got to make sure we can protect. And we go into emergency mode, because that was my responsibility. And I couldn't do much as far as New York goes. So I get a call from my daughter, Kim, that morning. And she said, Dad, I just want you to know that I called because I'm sure you're busy. I called Kim. I called Kara and Kevin, and they're both okay. I said, Kim, really, I'm grateful for that call. Thank you very, very much. So she calls me an hour and a half or so later. And she tells me, Dad, I spoke with Kara. They evacuated her to Jersey City. And she's like whacked out. She's stressed, but she's okay. Dad, the last time anybody saw Kevin, though, he was going over the site to see if he could help. Dad, have you heard from Kevin? No, Kim, I haven't. So I went through that afternoon. With a very, very real sense. I mean, I knew 2 buildings had gone down, and there was a real sense that I may have lost my son. Now, the pain that a parent would feel from losing a loved one in that situation, would be unbearable. I didn't know for sure I lost my son, but that was inside me. I had sort of an eerie sense of peace. And the reason why I had a sense of peace is because there was nothing that I would have wanted to tell my son that I hadn't already told him. He knew that I loved him. He knew I cared about him. He understood BAM. He understood spiritual soundness. He understood all those things. And I would never have wanted for any one of my children, any one of my loved ones, for one day the time to come where they pass. And I have not yet shared those things with them. Then around 5:00 that night, I got a call and said, "Dad, this is Kevin." I said, "Look, I'm okay, but I don't want to talk to anybody. Just tell everybody I'm okay." And so that was that. That's what happened there. Now, there's a story too, that the reason why I made sure they knew everything I went up because of the way I grew up in a situation I had with my mother. If you want to hear that story.
Yeah, I think I'd love to. I mean, I've heard you talk a little bit about it, but I think it's good for people to make that connection. Because that's where that's where this principle really stems from, right?
So I mentioned both my parents were immigrants, uneducated, and we lived in the Dyke Street section of New York City. It was a gang area at the time, very much a gang area. And I was the oldest of 5. 7 of us lived in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom apartment. 2 of my very best friends at grammar school that I was with every day got killed in high school. One died of a drug overdose. The other was killed by the police robbing a liquor store. Had I not been playing high school football, 100% I would have been with the guy robbing the liquor store. So that kind of woke me up a little bit. That shook me. And when I was 13, we had a family meeting. Now, I've had family meetings with my family, but growing up, this is the only family meeting we ever had. And it was about Mom was going to go in the hospital for a little while, but she was okay. It was just a routine thing. They had to check her up. It was no big deal. Okay, no big deal. So again, it was only 2 bedrooms, so there's 7 of us. So it wasn't like he had a lot of privacy. And I noticed my dad was kneeling by his bed, and I thought he was saying prayers, but he wasn't. He was crying. Now, again, my dad lived to his late 80s. I never ever saw him cry in my life. So I went over and said, "Dad, what's the matter?" He said, "Well, I'm worried about Mom." So I said, "Worried about Mommy." Okay, I went to bed that night, and I was overwhelmed with this feeling. I said, "Dad's crying." The dad to cry and be this concerned about somebody else. This got to be very, very, very serious. And I really thought this through. I knew I'd been working for my dad already in the store, but Mom was the one that was always there. She was always smiling. And when she came here from Ireland to marry my dad, nobody from Ireland could afford to come over. So actually, as of this day, 100% of my relatives are still in Ireland. So when she got married, in Mount Carmel Parish in the Bronx, where they filmed the Bronx there. And she was walking down the aisle in Mount Carmel Church. There was not one person in that church that she knew from home. So her whole life for us, that's it. And I remember thinking, as much as she cared about us and as much as she loved us, I had never, ever told my mother I loved her. And that really was ripping at me. I was a tough guy. That was really ripping at me. And I remember praying that night. I said, "Lord, please bring Mom home. If you do, I'm never going to make that mistake again." And she did turn out okay. And she did come home, and I never made that mistake again. It was that helped me really, truly understand it's important to be able to tell people certain things in your life, especially the people that you care about or have responsibility for. So with regard to my family, that is why there was nothing as time went on that I would have wanted to tell them that I hadn't told them. I learned that from that lesson when I was 13.
It sounds like you obviously had a unique upbringing as well, but it sounds like a lot of the experiences you've had have kind of shaped who you wanted to be as a dad. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I don't think there's any question about that.
So I kind of go back to this time at Miami, and feel free to frame this up for me if I'm not thinking about it right. But they just won a national championship, and you had an opportunity to be on the defensive coaching staff. Can you tell me about that experience?
So when we began at Dartmouth, it was 1981. I was defensive coordinator there, and by then we had 4 children, and we were in a staff meeting in the middle of the season, and the sheriff from town came in and needed to see me, and I thought there was a death in the family. He said, "Coach, I'm really sorry." He hands me divorce papers. So I couldn't afford to live independently and take care of my wife and 4 children. So I got permission to move into the storage room above the football offices. I didn't mind that, but I had no heat. I could see my breath. This is New Hampshire. I could see my breath in the wintertime. And I lived there for 2 years. So I was always thinking about, at some point, I got to live independently and I still got to be able to support my family. So how am I going to figure this out? So my next job is going to be pretty critical because I'm not staying in a loft all my life. And I always wanted to be head coach of a major college. So when January '84 comes, the Orange Bowl, Miami upsets Nebraska for the national championship. Bottom line is they offered me the secondary job with the idea that I will succeed with defensive coordinator when he leaves. There's not a more perfect job for me in my career. Every one of those guys got major college jobs. The guy whose job I would have taken was Mike Archer, the secondary coach. He got the head job at LSU. This was perfect. But coaches work made 7 days a week during football during the season. It's about an 80-hour work week. We don't get a day off unless there's a bye week. So you go 5 months without a day off. Back then, we didn't make much money. And I was going to get a raise from when I was at Dartmouth. I was getting enough of a raise that I could fly my family back, my kids back and forth. So I'd go 5 to 6 months and I would never see them. And went through that spiritual soundness exercise again. And the thought for me was, as much as I wanted that job, I don't think I would have been able to do my job right if I really didn't feel like I lived up to my responsibility as a father. So I turned down that job. Now, that was the toughest career decision I've ever made. But making that decision meant I had to get out of coaching. That's what made it tough. But that's what led me then ultimately to Wall Street. So in a way, that was sort of a blessing in disguise because I went on to another career path. Then ultimately had the good fortune to come back to football. But that's why that was spiritual soundness decision.
Wow. So looking back, obviously you made the right choice, but that's the toughest part, right? Like in the moment, I'm not saying 9 out of 10 dads would have taken it and figured it out. And obviously figuring it out doesn't mean you would be a present dad by any means. But that's one moment I look at. It's just got to be a heart-wrenching decision.
9 out of 10 coaches would have taken that job. I'm pretty confident in that. Well, it was gut-wrenching in the sense that I was leaving the career path that I really, really loved. Yeah, maybe. But remember, I think one of the things that I've taught my children, I teach my players, and I try to relay to other people around me over the span of my lifetime, is that when you really have to make an important decision, this is also a spiritual soundness concept. We really have to make an important decision. I'm a pretty emotional, passionate guy, but you've got to make an important decision with your head. You've got to give your intellect 51% vote. So I really, again, I'm writing it down, the pros and the cons. But at the end of the day, it wasn't that I was trying to be a perfect father or I wanted credit, but I really didn't think I could do my job the way I needed to do my job if I felt I wasn't doing my job over here. If I felt I was doing my job over here, I would have been able to really focus on what I needed to do. So once I decided this is the right thing to do for me, well, it was the right thing to do for me. Sad because I'm leaving coaching, but
how did they take that? Like, did you have to make the call, Joe, and like kind of deliver the news? And was it well received?
Well,
do you
no,
remember?
The guy I was talking to, Howard Schnellenberger, was the head coach. Tom Alvadati was the defensive coordinator. And he and I knew each other from being high school coaches in Delaware. So Tom and I were friends. So he called me and asked me to think about it. And I said, sure. I said, I'm great, Tom, I will. And I went back to him a few days later. And he said, Tom, I can't do this. I got to move in a different direction. So that was how that happened.
Okay. That's interesting. Do you feel like we left out any pivotal moments? I feel like you've got I've got a few other questions, but is there any other that you feel like is worth sharing that we haven't discussed?
The only thing I would say, so for one, the first time the spiritual soundness kind of came into being, what I didn't realize was making a decision to go to college when my father was trying to talk me out of it. But then spiritual soundness came in again when I was making a decision to coach from high school, from college rather instead of going to Wall Street. Later on, spiritual soundness came in again when I was making a decision to leave coaching to go to Wall Street. Spiritual soundness came in again later on when it was an opportunity for me to do something else relative to my career. I decided to go back to football. It also happens in my personal life. So I'm divorced twice. I'm not proud of that. And I remarried in 1995. Spiritual soundness went into that exercise. Having gotten divorced, obviously, I should have done a better job maybe of thinking that through. But so I'm reinforcing that point. Taking responsibility for yourself and knowing who you are and making decisions, have the guts to do what you believe is the right thing. that is really an incredible competitive advantage that people, if they have that, can have either in their personal life or their professional life. I'm thinking I could give you, if you want, one example in football that's an outstanding example of how BAM works, if you want to hear it.
Yeah.
It was our second or third season. We're in the national playoffs. We're in the playoffs every year. And we're in the national playoffs. We're ranked 7th or something in the country. We're playing Montana. They're ranked 4th in the country. And we were 11-1. And we're having a great season. And Sunday, we're getting ready to play Montana the next week. And I can tell it's not the same. Yeah, it was a great season. And there's not enough enthusiasm in the room. And I said something's wrong. So bottom line is the coach say, Coach, it's supposed to be the coldest game in the history of college football. It turned out it was -7 real and -26 wind chill. And the wind chill was always there. And he goes, these guys live in the mountains. You know, the nickname's the Grizzlies. You know, we're the Chanticleers and we live by the beach. And last week we practiced 72-degree weather. We've got guys that never saw snow physically and they don't even own coats. So that's going to be a tough thing to be able to adapt and adjust to. I said, okay, remember, BAM, take responsibility for yourself. So I said, what you're telling me then is that if we go there and lose, it's going to be because the weather's cold. And, you know, we couldn't do anything about that. I said, that's not acceptable. That means we're not taking responsibility for ourselves. We are subconsciously trying to let ourselves get off the hook. So what's the deal here? So the deal is, well, we weren't about a game plan. No, we've been playing 3 months. I said, so if the issue is the cold, let's handle the cold. So those of us that had some contacts, we called people that had done like research in the Arctic or research in incredibly cold weather. And, you know, the number one thing was we had to lose body heat through your head. And we weren't going to be able to acclimate to it. So how do we handle it for periods of time? So we tell our guys, we really, you know, we got to handle it. You know, can we handle it for an hour? All week, we spent 30 minutes in meetings, and then we practice this way. We practice the way we're going to have to play that game. So the first thing a player does usually when he comes off the field, he takes his helmet off. So we said, you can't take your helmet off. We had one bench instead of 5, 6 bench. We rented torpedo heaters. And they're like little jet engines, and we put them on the side of each bench. So when each side of the bench, so when the player comes off, he goes, he sits down, takes his hat, he puts it between his feet. We had radiant heaters over the head. Now we're doing all sorts of things with clothes and put stuff. We had chicken soup instead of like Gatorade, hot chicken soup. So now I go back in the game though, and I've got a warm head and a warm helmet, and my feet are warm, and I'm really only on the field for another 3 or 4 minutes. And our guys really said, okay, let's go. And some coach, you've got to be tougher than the other guy. It's not that cold. It's not this. It's not that. And that probably would have been a 7-point favorite playing at their place. It probably would have been maybe pick them if they were playing at our place, but they were favored by something like 27 points because of the weather. And there were headlines, the Cowboys playing the Beach Boys. And I said, and the coaches many times can be blockheads. I said, don't worry about the cold. You're tougher than that. Don't worry about the heat. You're tougher than that. Don't worry about the rain. I think that's crazy. So I said, it's really cold. So we're going to make sure we understand it's really cold. And we're going to educate ourselves so we learn how to handle it. Now, in situations like that, when the other coach is saying, you know, you be a tough guy, you be a tough guy, you be a tough guy. Don't worry about it. Especially we're playing these guys coming from the beach. So we're bundled up. You know, I'll see this much of my face. And it was cold. I never so cold in my life, but we were prepared. And here they come on the field. And they're wearing short sleeves. And I said, okay, they just had a talk all week about you guys are tougher than these guys are. You can handle the cold. Well, I did my homework. I checked the temperature in Montana in December. The average temperature was in the 20s. These guys have never experienced anything like this in a football game. Coldest game in history of football. So after 3 minutes, we were down 14-0. So that wasn't a great start. But by the end of the half, we were up 35-14. And we won the game handily. And it was 25 years. I was in high school, Fordham Prep and Xavier, talking about Lehigh, Lafayette and Lee, I'm talking Dartmouth and Harvard, Oklahoma and Nebraska. This is the greatest single victory I've ever been part of in my life because we didn't allow this to be an excuse. We focused on what the problem was. We solved the problem and the consequence of action. In this case, was an incredible, incredible victory. But I think that's a great example of how it's easy to make excuses. You know, my teacher doesn't like me. Oh, it's too cold outside. I'm having a problem with my girlfriend. My parents don't understand me. Be one excuse after another, after another, after another. But those are subconsciously letting yourself off the hook. BAM won't let you off the hook.
That's cool. It's back to the family roots and the lessons you learned. I love that. Is there someone in coaching who you if you think back to your football coaching career, I'm wondering who made the biggest sort of impression on you in that part of your career?
I think early on, probably from a coaching perspective, was probably Oliver Dottie. He was incredibly well organized. He was fortunate enough at the school he was at to be able to coach full time. I had to teach. By the way, my first head job, to this day, I'm the youngest head coach in the history of the state of Delaware. I was 22 at Archmere Academy. Joe Biden went to Archmere. So that's just an interesting factoid. So I think early on, it was probably Oliver Dottie in terms of, I was always organized anyway, but in terms of organizing, because nobody really taught me how to do. I didn't begin as a GA. I didn't begin as an intern. I kind of began trying to figure out everything on my own. So he probably helped very, very early. But as I became more sophisticated as a coach, a few years into my coaching, I think the two guys that I learned the most from were Vince Lombardi and John Wooden. So I read everything there is to read about Lombardi and Wooden. And they're two opposite personalities, opposite approaches. But I would think they both believe in the BAM philosophy without specifically using that. And they were both incredibly successful. And but two entirely different styles. And they were guys that I really did follow. But there were things that I wanted to use that they had, things that I wouldn't use because that was not a fit for me. So I got that too. That's a spiritual soundness concept as well. But they'd be the two that I would probably gotten the most from as a coach over the span of my career.
Was there a lesson from Lombardi, studying Lombardi and studying John Wooden that comes to mind, or like a lesson between both of them that stands out?
Well, I think with regard to Lombardi, he was an incredible disciplinarian. And again, 100 rules and a constant repetition. So he was a very, very bright guy, and he could have been a lot of different things. He could have been a lawyer. And I don't know if I really mean this because I have so much respect for him, but a little bit of a blockhead in terms of his approach. This is the way we did it. That's it. And he did the same thing again. And I'm not suggesting he wasn't creative, but he was a taskmaster. And this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to do it. We're going to repeat 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 it. And this is the way you're going to act. And these are the rules. This is the way you're going to follow. Again, there's a plus to that, but there's also a minus. But that wasn't specifically, that was my style early on, by the way. But I changed that significantly later on. Whereas Wooden would be more of a Zen master. He would be more like one with the universe. He would be the one meditating. And wanted the kids to make sure they really understood like why they were doing what they were doing and the concepts behind what they were doing. A very, very, very thoughtful guy. And he's the one that has the principles. It's the pyramid of success and the different boxes. Many of those boxes I can espouse to, and some not necessarily for me, but two different styles. And that's the way one, you said earlier that coaching, homemade, is both kind of a science and art. 100%. 100% I would agree with that. Wooden was more the art guy. Lombardi was more the science guy.
Where does Bill Walsh fit into your philosophy, if at all?
Well, when I was coaching, I had spent so much time coaching. And then remember, I had my family, I had other things going on that I didn't spend a lot of time paying attention to other college football games. I didn't spend much attention to watching the pros. Now, I know he did an incredible job with the West Coast offense. And there's no question he was a great coach. But when I went home, if I had free time, I didn't want to watch football. I want to listen to music. I want to read. I want to watch a movie. And then when I switched to Wall Street, I had a lot to catch up because all these other MBAs really had a far greater advantage in understanding the buzzwords and the concepts and what duration meant and convexity meant. I had to learn all those things. And then I was really, really focused. And then after I moved into executive management, I really got a new job pretty much every 3 years. So every new job I had was a job that I really didn't know that much about. So I really had to stay on top of that. And we were pretty successful at it. Then I go to Ameritrade. We're going to business. I really got to focus on that. So over the span of I was a sports fan as a teenager. But then as I became an adult and became a father, became a coach, became a teacher, became a business guy, I didn't have time for it. So I actually tell people, I'm surprised you, but I'm not a big football fan. I don't know who's playing quarterback for who. I don't know who's doing what, where. I actually, my family was with me over New Year's. And I actually said to them, I said, now is a good time in my life. I mean, I do love sports. I should go back to being a fan. I should go back to when I was a teenager. And they started to tell me, the best way to do that is fantasy football. Fantasy football gets you right in, and we all kind of part of it. So my grandson, who's 10 or 11, he's a bright kid. He says to me, "Oh, Grandpa, this would be great. Fantasy football, we can do it together." Yeah, that'd be great. Now, I know you don't call your own plays. I know you pick players. You know how it works for fantasy football?
At a high level, I've never played it.
Nor have I. But at a high level,
I take pride in not doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You pick your player. So you pick your players, and then depending how they do, you kind of get the points, whatever. But that's sort of how it works. And again, I've never done it before, but my family's going to teach me. So little Robert was telling me, Grandpa's great. He's giving me some pointers. I said, this would be great because my experience in football, Robert, I've been a coach for 25 years. I'm going to go in, I'm going to call plays, beat all the rest of the guys. No, Grandpa, you can't call plays. I said, no, I got to call plays. No, Grandpa, you can't call plays. I said, no, I coached for 25 years. I can call plays. I know what I'm doing, Robert. He goes, Grandpa, you really can't call plays? And he started to panic a little bit. I said, okay, wait until you really teach me what's going on. So, so I will probably start to do that this year.
That's funny. That's cool. It sounds like also just something, time well spent with the family doing something, I think that's the other.
100%.
Okay. So, I wanted to ask you this before we wrap. You think about your time leading as CEO of Ameritrade. What was one of the maybe toughest decisions that you had to make? Because I think that's obviously a big job. I know we've talked a lot about sports, but I can't imagine it was easy. You've got, I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, like 13,000 plus people, mergers, things like that. Like, I'm wondering, when you think back to your time there, what was one of the tougher decisions you had to make, and how did you process it?
The toughest decisions are usually the personnel decisions. Am I hiring the right person? And if I don't have the right person, I got to make a tough decision on that person. They're the toughest ones. The most critical ones were the ones with regards to the acquisitions, the consolidations. So when I got there, we had a $700 million market cap. We had lost money for the last 26 years, the entire history of the firm. And we were going out of business. And we kind of cleaned up our own act. We did a pretty good job of that. And then into the year, Schwab should have. So the time period was March 2000, March 2003. So it's the recession post the dot-com bubble burst. And Schwab really should have rolled up the industry, but they didn't bother. They were trying to be Merrill Lynch. So nobody started yet. So we began this. So National Discount Broker, we paid $154 million for NDB when we were worth $700 million at the time. If we screw up that integration, we were out of business. The next one we did okay with that. We bought Baytech. We were worth 1.1 billion. They were worth 1.1 billion. If we screw up that, we're out of business. Now, from then on, even though we did bigger acquisitions, we already had a stable foundation, and we were okay. So they were probably the two most critical ones we had. And then ultimately, as chairman, is a little bit different, but the Schwab thing was sort of a big decision as well. But the toughest decisions were always the personnel decisions.
That's great. Last question for you. What is a book that has made a big impact on you that you recommend other people read? And it doesn't have to be one, but I'm wondering if there's at least one that comes to mind.
Well, the one I enjoyed the most, because I read it when I was at Merrill Lynch a while ago, was The Gold Coast. I think it was by Nelson DeMille, I think. And it's about a mafia guy, a mafia guy who moves to the Gold Coast, Long Island. And I think he buys, a mansion on the Gold Coast for like $10 million. He brings it back and pays for it in cash. And the people that he starts to interact with. It was actually a pretty good book. I enjoyed that. But one of the books that I really enjoyed was Aren't There Any Leaders Anymore? It was written by Iacocca. And so I read about his life and his story. I thought he was an excellent leader. I thought he was an excellent businessman. I liked the way he kind of approached things.
Well, cool, Joe. I appreciate you making the time. I'll circle back with Dave. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll light something up. And again, great meeting you. And yeah, definitely be great to stay in touch.
Likewise, Joe, mate. I'd be glad to do that.
All right. Thanks, Joe. Cheers. Bye.
Bye-bye.